All right, hi there, Year 10. This video is going to be a bit longer than usual because what this video is going to do is we are going to go over basically everything you've done in lockdown. Now, for those of you that may have missed a lesson here or there, this is a perfect opportunity. Than rather catching up with the work you've missed, it's keeping up with the demands of lockdown. So when you return, we are going to be doing an assessment. However, I need to make sure that everyone is in the same position. So this roughly 40-minute video will go through everything you need to know for Unit 1 of American West. Then in the second week back after you return, we will begin going through Unit 2. So this is what we've done so far. 12 topics, we've done a few assessments. Some topics have taken longer than others. Unit 1 tends to be the biggest topic out of the three, the biggest unit out of the three. So we've looked at Native American structure, importance of the buffalo and horses, Indian belief in nature, land and war, government policy, why did settlers migrate, push versus pull, and we focus on the Oregon Trail, the California Gold Rush and the consequences, problems of traveling the Oregon Trail, Donner Party and the Mormons, problems of living and farming on the plains, Fort Laramie Treaty, and law and order and law enforcement 1835 to 1862. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each one of these one by one. I'm going to spend about 3-4 minutes talking through them. Before I do that, I just want to remind you of the 3 types of questions that you will have on the American West paper. So this is just a reminder of your end of Unit 1 assessment. Okay, it's going to be 3 of these questions. I'm not going to go through that too much, okay? But explain 2 consequences of the Indian Appropriation Act, explain the importance of Brigham Young to Mormon settlement, explain 2 consequences of the Fort Laramie Treaty, explain the importance of buffaloes to the lives of the Native Americans. They're all 8 markers, but I think it's important that I go through the types of questions that you will have on the American West paper. So question number 1, explain 2 consequences. Now remember, a consequence is something that happens because of something. It can be good, it can be bad, it can be short term, it can be long term, it can affect a range of people, it can affect 1 person, 5 people, 10 people. Consequences are a broad concept. It will always focus on consequence. Now, this requires you to explain 2 valid consequences, giving equal attention to both, which means you can't just do 10 lines on the first consequence and 3 on the second. It's got to be specific. Now, roughly, I think you should aim for 6-7 lines per consequence with a specific historical fact. This is how I think you should do it. So number 1, give a very clear consequence. Number 2, give evidence to support the consequence. And then number 3, explain what that evidence led to. All right. Now on the board, it's not a perfect example, but it's an example from an exam a few years ago. 2 consequences of the gold rush for migration. Be careful here because this question is actually asking how the gold rush had an impact on migration, which means movement. And this is a consequence of the gold rush of 1849 was that many people migrated Eastern America, where gold was found in places like California, leading to overcrowding in the east, with 46,000 moving over in hope of finding gold. There's lots of historical errors in there, but you can see they got quite a good mark for this. I haven't shown you the second one, but just be careful. The key thing about American West is your accuracy and your depth. Question number 2, we actually haven't done any of these yet. It's a narrative account question. Now, you'll be asked to write a narrative account analysing an event over a period of time. It could be a short period or it can be a much longer period. So a narrative account is basically a chronological account that links. It has a beginning, middle, and end. 2 years ago, the question was writing a narrative account analysing the events of Mormon migration in the years 1846 to 1847. In last year's paper, it was about law and order over a much longer period of time. Key thing is that you've got to make sure that it basically flows and the answer links. So it shouldn't be just random events. The answer should link in a chronological order. They should chronolink, okay? How you answer this is you give the first part of the narrative, describe it and explain what it led to. Secondly, give the middle part of the narrative, describe it and explain what it led to. And lastly, give the end of the narrative, describe it, and explain what it led to. Imagine you're writing a narrative of the normal day. So write a narrative account of what Mr. Rochester did from 8 a.m. till 4 p.m. If you miss a big chunk of that, then my day's not going to make any sense. So it must make sense. It must be like a flowing answer that talks about the beginning of the period, that leads to the middle, that goes to the end. All right, chronolink. The third question, you actually have two of these where you explain the importance of blank to blank. Okay, so you get a choice of three and you answer two of them. You should aim to write 3 paragraphs. So giving a piece of evidence about the first thing, for example, give me a 4-line description of the Indian Appropriation Act, then you explain how that evidence was important to the second thing. So if you can see, this is a whole answer, most of a whole answer on the board. But you need to make sure you give a piece of evidence about the first thing. So if the question is explain the importance of the Indian Appropriation Act, you tell me something about the Indian Appropriation Act. And then you explain why that was important to the second thing. If you just tell me something about the Indian Appropriation Act, you're going to get half marks. If you link it to the second event or second group, you're going to do much, much better. So they're the 3 types of questions that you will have at American West. Okay. Now, what we've done in Unit 1 so far, I'm going to go through each in probably about 4 or 5 minutes. I'll aim to try not to talk too much. So Native American structure and their way of life. While I'm talking, if you want to make notes on it, please do. So Native American society, we need to know about the society, the beliefs, how they survive, their family life. We're going to touch upon the role of horses in this one and Indian warfare, which we'll talk about a bit more later. So tribes were made up. I'll do a little bit of underlining here so we've got some key things that you can focus on. So tribes were made up of bands. So you had tribes that were made up of bands of around 10 to 50 families. And they'd meet up often once or twice a year for a buffalo hunt. Buffalo hunts weren't needed significantly, constantly. They were needed when it was important. And buffalo, you could survive from one buffalo hunt for a fair few months. Chiefs were the leaders of the Indian society as they were chosen for their skill, so their leadership, the spiritual, the wisdom or fighting. However, they didn't need to be listened to, and they could actually lose their power. They didn't inherit power. Okay. Some of the most famous chiefs were people known as Red Cloud and Sitting Bull, but they had no real power because everything had to be agreed by a council. So you had the council who agreed the most important decisions. The chief might be a part of that council, but that council decided the biggest decisions. So that was more important you understand that. Then you had your warrior brotherhoods, who were trained young fighters who led the buffalo hunt and went to war. They didn't have to follow council orders though, which caused problems. So if this group here made a decision, this group here did not need to listen, which caused all sorts of problems when decisions were made much later on. Okay. Indian beliefs, which we'll look at a bit more in a future slide, but the Plains Indians believed in the great spirit, Wakan Tanka, who created the world. Everything was equal and sacred, people and nature. They used dances when the whole tribe needed to contact the spirits. So, for example, before a buffalo hunt, they did the buffalo dances. Some land was sacred, such as the Black Hills of the Sioux. So the Black Hills of Dakota to the Sioux Nation, because they were burial grounds. And the key thing is that land was incredibly sacred to the Native Americans. It's like the mother of the land. They believed it couldn't be owned or brought by anyone as it belonged to everyone. Farming and mining was seen as massively disrespectful, which you'll learn later becomes a bit of a problem when people start migrating throughout the plains. Survival on the plains was based on hunting buffalo. If you didn't have the buffalo to hunt, then survival was going to be very difficult. And the key thing about their survival was their nomadic lifestyle. The fact they were always moving their camps based around the buffalo, living in teepee, which means they could pack it up within minutes in something called a travois, which meant they could be on the move, so they could follow these guys here. Teepees were perfect for the plains. They were made from wood and buffalo skin. They were circular, which helped with the weather conditions, the windy weather conditions, and also there's that link of the circle of life as well. And they were warm in the winter, cool in the summer. But some Native Americans also lived in wooden lodges during the winter, because remember, the winter could get pretty horrific. Now, family life, each person had a role equally important as the other. So, whereas in other history topics, we talk about how the woman's maybe less equal than the man, that is totally the opposite in Native American society. All right, women, also known as squaws, were responsible for the home and the family. They were responsible for turning the buffalo remains into things like the hides, the meats, making sure that the men were adequately fed, but they were seen as very, very important. Men were responsible for hunting, looking after the horses, and protecting the bands. And elders, the elderly members of the tribe, were often members of the council, which we talked about earlier, and they're often highly respected. Warfare, I'm not going to talk about in this one, but warfare is very important, which we'll talk about in the later slide. But the role of horses was vital to their nomadic lifestyle. So horses were essential. They were needed to hunt buffalo for the constant travel. And they were also important for status. So Native American men measured their wealth with their horses. So the Comanche tribe had over 8,000 horses in a tribe of 3,000 men. So it is important for the status and wealth. Horses were also key to the warfare there because Indians would often raid other tribes to steal their horses. And horsemanship tended to be a sign of bravery as well. So that's just a brief little overview of Native American structure and society. Okay, if you want to rewind this and obviously make notes on it, please do. But that's the first lesson that we did. The second lesson, we're mainly going to focus on the importance of buffalo because I focused on horses in the last slide. The buffalo was basically the Native American survival. So important that we understand that without the buffalo, Indian survival would have been very difficult. And it was based on following the migration of buffalo across the plains. There were millions of buffalo on the Great Plains, but they only hunted enough to survive. Now, there's a key word here, which I'm going to put in the top corner, is reverence, which means they had a respect for the buffalo. Moving on. The buffalo hunt was a key event with all Native Americans, okay? Tribes all over joining the spring hunt, and there were three key parts. So the buffalo dance was a spiritual ceremony to call the buffalo close and pray for a successful hunt. This would be done before anything actually happened. So if anything, this was the luck part. So that would be done before. It was to bring luck to the tribe. Secondly, the actual hunt. So the hunt was organised. You only need 2 to 3 a year to feed your bands. The warriors would tend to stampede on the buffalo, but before that, they would tend to obviously scout down the buffalo. They'd circle the buffalo to make sure they didn't lose them. And it was about making sure that no lives were lost and enough buffalo were killed for the band to survive for that set time. Once the buffalo hunt was completed, women and children would process all of the buffalo. The key thing is that the only part of the buffalo that wasn't used was the heart, because that's the spiritual part of the buffalo, which would be buried into the ground following the successful hunt. Now, if you want to know what is used for each part of the buffalo, have a look at this document, this photo. I'm not going to go through everyone, but what you need to understand is every part of the buffalo was used. All right? The wastage was not an option for Native Americans. The overall importance of the buffalo, which could link to the question that you've got in the exam, it's important for warfare. So buffalo hunts were the center of warrior life. It's where boys became men during the twice yearly hunt to improve their skills. The bones were used to make knives, whilst the sinews, so like the veins of the buffalo, were used to make bowstrings. The buffalo was also important to everyday society. Okay, for men, women, and children. So men went on the hunt and women and children processed the buffalo. Many tribes and bands would join together for the spring hunt, bringing together communities of Native Americans. Even the buffalo was central to the Indian beliefs. They would do the buffalo dance before the hunt and bury the heart out of respect for the buffalo and nature, which we'll talk about in a later slide. Everyday life was really important to everyday life. The dung of the buffalo was used as fuel. The fur was used for pillows. The teepee was made from 10 to 20 buffalo skins. The buffalo could feed the Native Americans for months. Dried meat was eaten in the winter, so like a jerky kind of meat. Even the tongue, sometimes eaten, sometimes used as a hairbrush, and the brain was eaten as like a treat, a delicacy. But as I mentioned, because of the reverence of the buffalo, only enough was hunted to keep the population of the buffalo going. If the buffalo died out, it was going to be very hard for the Native Americans to survive in the long term. The third topic we did in Unit 1 is Indians' belief in nature, land, and war. So we had to have an understanding of what Native Americans believed, but more importantly, how their beliefs began to conflict with the white settlers. Because as time went on, more white settlers migrated to America, and especially across America, where most of the Native Americans had been living for actually many, many years before America was founded in its full entity. So in regards to nature, we've mentioned this previously, but it's important we go over it again. And if a good little task here, you lot, is to choose 10 words to summarize each one. Everything in nature had a spirit. These spirits would sometimes help humans. Humans were a part of nature, and they should work with the spirits of nature rather than trying to tame nature to obey them. You can contact the spirit world through vision quests, guided by spirit animals like hawks or foxes. You used to dance special ritual dances like the sun dance to enter the spirit world. And it's used to use like the spirit world to charge up magic items, so like charms, which you could wear to bring you protection during some of the most important times as a Native American. So mainly things like the buffalo hunt and sometimes warfare. Secondly, land. Land was sacred, the mother of the plains. Now, there were some parts that were more sacred than others, like the Black Hills of Dakota. And the Lakota Sioux believed that people had been created in this special hill in caves by the great spirit Wakantanka. Some Plain Indian tribes farmed the land as well as living by hunting, fishing, and gathering. Most of the plains was basically impossible to farm. And what the Native Americans believed was that no one person owned the land as property. This was probably down to their nomadic lifestyle, but it does cause conflict later on when the migration of America comes into full force. All Plains Indian tribe did have hunting grounds they used together, so sometimes tribes would agree with treaties to share the hunting grounds. When food was scarce, conflicts would occur as tribes used to push into hunting areas that were used by others. So that's why war might occur if a tribe breaks a treaty and comes into another tribe's land. And as I previously mentioned in the first slide, farming and mining was seen as disrespectful to the land because it disrupts the sacred link, and that could cause all sorts of conflict later on when we do the course. And the last one, war. Now, war for Native Americans was very different to what we see as war today. So survival on the plains was very difficult. And some Native American tribes would raid each other for food, horses, and weapons, and sometimes even people. Women would be married off, and children would be used to bring up the tribe for the future. Young men in particular were valuable to the tribe as hunters and protectors. No tribe could afford to lose many warriors in fights. A raid would only happen if it looked like it was going to be successful and you could get away as quickly as possible. Unlike the white settlers, white Americans, who believed they should never run. Running was a sign of cowardice. Only certain brotherhoods would go on a raid, so it reduces the tribe's losses. And for Native Americans, it was all about bravery. Okay, so coup means success. An accounting coup was a special type of fighting in which a warrior would attempt to hit or touch an enemy using their coup stick rather than killing them. The worst thing that could happen to a Native American is getting scalped, because that means their spirit would not go into the afterlife, the happy hunting ground, which again, Native Americans believed significantly in. How did the Native Americans go against the white settlers' viewpoint? Well, the white settlers had very contrasting views, very opposite views, including belief in owning land, belief the war should be about winning and violence, land should be used in making profit, manifest destiny, really important term, the idea that white settlers own all the land. It's this religious vision. And land should be farmed on and used for profit. So there were contrasting views, contrasting sort of viewpoints, which caused conflict much later on when we start looking at Native American warfare against the white settlers. Number 4 is government policy, 1835 to 1851. We've got to know about how the government reacted against the Native Americans and what the government tried to do with different policies. Now, you might be asked about these policies in the exam, like you've got in the exam, looking at the importance of the policies towards the Native Americans' way of life. So Native Americans and government. So white Americans believed that Indians were savages who did nothing to improve the land. They believed they had the right, white Americans believed they had the right to own the land and they could improve it by farming it, turning America into a civilized country. White Americans also believed that the Indians should all learn to farm or be pushed off their land. And this is what became a problem for the government. The federal government had a conundrum here. There was a so-called Indian problem. So the government had possibly two things to do. They could either keep the settlers and Indians apart or encourage the Indians to become like white settlers. And this is where the 4 policies come into play. So for each one of these, my advice would be obviously just to summarize them, okay? And then understand the narrative. So these are seen as a narrative. You could get a narrative account question on government policy towards the Native Americans. So you need to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The first 2, I think, would be our beginning. So in 1830, the government introduced something called the Indian Removal Act. And this is where President Jackson signed this, okay? That was an awfully drawn line. And what the Indian Removal Act did was it forced 46,000 Indians, like the Cherokee, living in the east of America. So this part of America was where some Native Americans lived. Forced them to move into Indian territory, which was west of the Mississippi River. Now, there was promises that the land would be theirs forever. So once they moved, they would never have to move again. This would allow the white settlers on the Indian land to settle in the east. So basically, it was about keeping them separate. Native Americans try and stay here, white settlers try and stay here. However, as America grew, this was going to become a significant problem. By 1834, this is where this border became more defined and more official. So the Trade and Intercourse Act of 1834 defined Indian territory as the lands west of the Mississippi River. So anything west, so all we've got here of the Mississippi River, was classed as Native American land. And this would be where the white settlers will stay. So to keep the whites and Indians apart, the government set up the Permanent Indian Frontier. Now, the most ironic word here is permanent because it was far from permanent, but it was a border between the Indian Territory and the white states, which contained soldiers and forts. So you'd have like soldiers and forts based on here. But as America grew, that they wouldn't be stopped, the white settlers. But this act said it would stop whites from settling on Indian land and vice versa. So the government had effectively given the Native Americans their own land, which is basically mainly the Indian Territory. But as America grows, there becomes all sorts of problems, which means white settlers need to travel through Indian Territory to get to certain parts. Okay. Now, as America grows, there's a big moment here in the 1840s because the US gained territory in the West. And the problem with that is that to get there, you do have to go through Indian Territory. So between 1845 and 1848, US territory grew with Texas and Oregon, okay, becoming part of the USA. Also, after victory against Mexico, America also gained California, roughly there. This becomes a problem because if the people in the East, I'm going to just change my drawing thing here. If the people in the East want to get to these areas, they might have to go through Indian territory, which the government promised wouldn't happen. Okay, so the government are going to have to think about breaking that border that they promised the Native Americans back in 1834. So the government encouraged its citizens to move to these new territories. So the government actively encouraged people in the East to move to these areas, which was breaking the Indian frontier. The quickest way to get to these areas was going to be going through Indian territory. It was breaking the Trade and Intercourse Act, and it caused significant tension between the white settlers and the Native Americans, because the Native Americans felt like they had been cheated, as they were promised their land would stay, or maybe white settler free. And then in 1851, you got a very, very important piece of legislation known as the Indian Appropriation Act. This is where the government set up reservations in Indian territory to move Indians onto. So the Indian territory, this red part here, had little plots of land set up where Native Americans were basically told to stay. Each tribe would be told to stay in certain areas. Okay. Now this was a problem, okay, because the reservations were controlled by the government, and it aimed to limit Indian life by putting the reservations far from tribes' sacred places, so places like the Black Hills of Dakota. It was very far from buffalo's hunting ground, so they're trying to basically assimilate the Native Americans into white settlers' way of life. They were trying to civilize the Indians by encouraging them to farm, as there was less buffalo, go to school, and get their kids to become Christians. Okay? So all of these things here are quite problematic. The reservations were quite large to start with, and as time went on, became a lot smaller. All right, but that's the important thing here, is that the government started off quite lenient, and as America began to grow, they become a lot harsher. They tried to get the Native Americans to assimilate rather than having respect for their way of life. All right, the fifth thing we've looked at, year 10, is why did settlers migrate? So why did settlers move? And this is where we look at push and pull factors. And one of the most important reasons why the settlers migrated was this discovery of something called the Oregon Trail. So before we go into the why people migrated, I think it's very important that you have an understanding of what this Oregon Trail is. And if you look at this map, this is the route of the Oregon Trail. There were lots of different routes. Some people would get to certain areas and break off to get to other areas. But this Oregon Trail was a perfect opportunity for people to get to the west of America as safely as possible. So in 1824, Jed Smith discovered a path through the Rockies to the west, and this was used by pioneers. So the pioneers were the first ever settlers into the west. It became the Oregon Trail as the final destination was the state of Oregon. Now in 1841, the first wagon train traveled the 3,200-kilometer trail, which led from Missouri through the plains, the Rocky Mountains, and then to Oregon. It was a very risky journey, and later on, we're going to look at how you do this journey safely, and people that did it well and people that didn't do it so well. By 1843, over 900 pioneers made the dangerous journey west. It was called the Great Emigration. And in that same year, a few farmers also crossed the Rockies to get to California, which was obviously where I've put the arrow in blue. Between 1841 to 1869, the Oregon Trail was the main wagon route to the west. It led off to the California Trail, which opened in 1843, and overall, roughly 400,000 people crossed the Oregon Trail. Now, what we need to look at here is why did people decide to begin migrating west? So during the American West, many people migrated to Oregon, California, the new states, and they went for lots of reasons. So they went for economic reasons, territorial reasons, religious reasons, or simply the adventure of starting a new life. Okay, so here you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9 reasons, and we need to understand the pull reasons, so the pulling people to the west, and the push. So what's pushing people away to making them go to the west? Okay, so in 1842, the government passed something called the Preemption Act, which allowed settlers to claim 140 acres of land and purchase it for $1.25 per acre after a year. That was the government's way of trying to get more people to settle in different parts of America. The cheap land acreage probably would have pulled them, because after staying for a year, it means they would have farmed on it, they would have settled on it, but making it potentially more accessible is going to be a pull factor for people who wanted to start a new life. Searching for space. So as the Midwest became increasingly settled, some were attracted by the chance to settle on the new frontier in places like Oregon and California. Collapse in cereal crop prices. So farmers in the Mississippi Valley, so we're looking at around this area here, struggled due to an economic depression as wheat and corn prices dropped. And they believed that starting fresh in the West was a very attractive proposition. They thought they would be able to develop a new life with the farming possibilities being endless. The gold rush is something we'll look at a bit later, but gold was discovered in the Sierra Nevada, California in 1848, leading to 200,000 people leaving the east in April 1849 in hopes of finding gold. The expansion and development of new territory was also really important, because the British had agreed to give Oregon to America in 1848, and the defeat of Mexico meant that the pre-Mexican colony of California became part of the USA in 1848. There was a significant economic depression in 1837 in the East, where banks collapsed and unemployment went up to 25%, which meant that lots of people in the East thought that the West offered a better way of life and an opportunity to start again. Manifest destiny was also a really important sort of factor to pull people to the west of America, because many Americans believed it was their God-given duty to spread their civilization and democracy across the whole of the United States. Groups like the Mormons, which again we'll talk about later, tried to aim to move to escape religious persecution. And then you've also got that certain land in the West was very fertile. So mountain men and the first pioneers used to send back stories of large, free, fertile farmlands in Oregon and California, which was perfect for fruit farming. All of these were reasons why people decided to migrate, and it does become very important to understand why the government had to change their viewpoint and why they had to become stricter on the Native Americans, because for the government, westward expansion was a possibility to really push their economy and for them to earn more money in themselves. Right, the last thing this video is going to go through is the California Gold Rush, and then you're going to have part 2, which will talk about the other 6 items that we've done so far. So the California Gold Rush was one of the biggest pull factors, which essentially made more people move to the west of America. So in 1848, gold was discovered in the West, mainly in California, and this type of news spreads very quickly. And by 1849, huge numbers of miners descended on California using the new California Trail. So if you have a look on this map here, the red trail is the Oregon Trail. And when they reach areas like Fort Bridger or Fort Hall, they split off and use the California Trail. The green trail is the Mormon Trail, which obviously we'll look at later. But this map's really important because you need to understand the pink areas is where like gold was found. And these sort of shaded areas is where all the mountains were. So it shows how dangerous the journey is, okay? Most important thing you need to know for this is what were the consequences. Now, my advice would be to make a good consequences, bad consequences table, because it really did depend on what sort of person you were. So thousands of people came from all over the world, including over 25,000 Chinese miners who sailed from Hong Kong. They came to America because there was a famine going on, and they thought that America would be an opportunity to start afresh. These 49ers, or prospectors, came for the chance to make it rich and for a new start in cities like San Francisco in California. As a result, the population of California grew significantly from 15,000 in 1848 to 300,000 by 1855, and this led to mining towns growing like Virginia City. As the population grew, more people moved west to become shopkeepers, bartenders, and tradesmen, selling mining equipment. Now, this was a big consequence because a lot of these people who were selling equipment inflated their prices. So you could buy a pan to pan the gold in for 15 cents, and some people sold them for like $15 because they realized that people would be looking for them. But most of the people that went for gold didn't find gold, and they either left or they settled in California and became farmers. Okay. And the reason they became farmers was because, if you see in this point 1 here, there were excellent conditions for things like growing fruits, like oranges. And California soon became one of the main central exporting areas, exporting crops all over the world because of the amount that were being made. There were many people who became rich, and the gold helped the US recover from that economic crisis in the East. And it even helped pay for the railroad, which we'll look at later on, that was completed in 1869. A negative aspect of this, though, was that the gold rush did attract crooks, bandits, gamblers, and outlaws who migrated to live in all-male communities that were full of violence, racism towards the Chinese, claim jumping, salting a claim, which means you sprinkle a bit of salt, a bit of gold on the land, and then sell it to inexperienced prospectors for a overly inflated price. Mining towns were isolated from other communities, which meant that law and order was hard to enforce. Miners' courts were set up, but we'll talk about law and order in the slide a bit later on. So that's part 1 of Unit 1, Year 10. Okay, part 2 will be in the next video, which your teacher will ask you to watch. If you've got any questions, obviously let us know, but that is Unit 1 of American West in a nutshell.